ever to suffer today.
What I suffered yesterday.
I want the truth be known, so shout out loudly. Helpless right is wrong, that's the message in our song. Let the truth
People here who don't know me, my name is John Field. I'm the chair and the president of the Amicus Front sector in Scotland. And I'm also acting in a capacity as trade union liaison officer for Mojo, the Miscarriage of Justice organisation. And John and Paddy will explain more about why we're here at the TUC, what the organisation is doing and what they hope to achieve. I think it's timely to hold such a meeting right now in Brighton, because we're at a period when hard-won civil liberties are under threat as never before. And it's sad to say that that's happening under a government with the word Labour in its title. We all strongly condemn indiscriminate bombings and attacks, but it must be said that legislation that comes in the wake of such attacks is panic legislation, and it's often bad legislation. At least the type of situation that Paddy Hill found himself in Birmingham, and at least the situations like the state murder that we witnessed in the streets of London the other week of the young Brazilian John Charles Menendez, and that's a bad situation. If we could quote Jeremy Corbyn on the same subject in this Morning Star. Jeremy was here this afternoon. He's talking about the ID cards going through Parliament. A proposed cost of £16 billion to introduce biometric profiling of the entire population in a national database for something that won't work anyway. And it really is quite frightening. And as Jeremy points out in the article too, that Nelson Mandela and African National Congress could have been banned under the kind of proposals that Clark is considering now. So that's why we've got to be vigilant. But without any further ado from me, the first speaker is going to be Satish Sekar, who is on my right. Satish is the author of a book here, Fitted In. It's the story of the Cardiff Three, something that became a cause celebre throughout the country. And Satish will explain all about that now. Satish.
7 years ago, I wrote and published this book, Fitted In, the Cardiff Three and the Lynette White Inquiry. The reason I wrote it was to highlight what was one of the worst miscarriages of justice in British history. And the reason I say that is that when you actually look at the facts of this case, it is extraordinary that nobody burst out laughing when the prosecution case was told. This, in a short nutshell, is what you have to believe if you want to believe the police's case. Stephen Miller went to the flat, committed what was then the most brutal murder in Welsh history. It involved over 50 stab wounds, with the deceased's throat cut from ear to ear. And as I say, it was one of the worst murders in British history. There were several bits of forensic evidence, including blood, hair, footprints, all sorts of scientific evidence that the murderer had left behind. Not a scrap of it tied any of the 5 men who were eventually charged to the murder and to that room. The police were looking for one white man. 10 months later, 5 black men were arrested. There is only one possible reason that this could have happened, and that must be because South Wales police were confronted by a dangerous new breed of criminal who had mastered metamorphosis. It's simply the only explanation. They are now able to go to change colour at will and clone themselves into a number of criminals. That must be what happened here. But in Miller's case, you have to believe this if you want to believe the prosecution case. He goes to that flat, commits this murder, does not interfere with any of the forensic evidence that is found in that flat. He doesn't show any attempt to interfere with it, but he cleans every single trace that ties him to that flat and to the victim without interfering with the scientific evidence. He then cleans himself and his clothes to such a high standard that not a speck of blood is on the clothes, on him. It then dries incredibly quickly to show no attempt to wash these clothes. without interfering with the dirt on the white parts of his stone-washed jeans. He then goes across the road to the nearby Casablanca nightclub and plays pool without a change in general demeanour within 20 minutes of the most likely time of the murder. And he achieves all this with the IQ of an 11-year-old child. This was the police's case. The problem is that Stephen Miller's lawyers allowed this alibi to languish in the unused material. And this raises one of the major points with the criminal justice system. It assumes that lawyers perform to the best of their abilities on the day and that no mistakes will be made. Well, how can you assume that? How can it be reasonable for a person in Miller's position who needed the best representation possible to be lumbered with representation as bad as this, to actually miss the significance of what this meant? Now, that case went on to the point that there was masses of forensic evidence, none of which tied the accused to the crime. 3 men got convicted when 2 were acquitted on exactly the same evidence. The verdicts were blatantly unlawful and proven so. And eventually, the 3 men won their appeal when the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Taylor, said he never wanted to hear a tape containing such bullying ever again in his court. The point with this is, this was after the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. The interviews with Stephen Miller were fully taped. He had the full protection of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. This was simply not supposed to happen anymore. This was after the Maxwell Comfey case and after the Royal Commission that proved it. And this tells us one thing that is of great importance. After miscarriages of justice and these types of things are exposed and Royal Commissions happen, the sad legacy of Royal Commissions is that they end up legitimising the very powers that caused the miscarriage of justice and were illegally employed against people originally. The result is the Royal Commission gives them the power to do this legally. Now, in this particular case, what became the most important part of it was the DNA evidence was very, very bad quality back in 1988. It wasn't ready to make the contribution that it did. But it was possible, if it had been stored properly, to actually find the real murderer. And that is what is unique about this particular case. It is the first time in British history that after a miscarriage of justice, the real murderer was caught and convicted. And to some extent, it required a pursuit of the truth and the publication of this book and forcing of the authorities to investigate. And this should be raising the simple question: why is it necessary to force the authorities to look for the real murderer? They say the victims of crime are important. Well, why, after a miscarriage of justice is exposed and a conviction is quashed, is it not automatically reopened? And if a police force is too stubborn to do so, because one of the things you need to realise about this case is, immediately after the Cardiff 3 were free, the South Wales Police conducted a secret investigation in which they concluded they had done nothing wrong. Now, this is now a case where 28 people have been arrested, because the one thing that the finding of the real murderer did, and you have to give credit to South Wales Police because they established a new unit to actually resolve this and find the real murderer, but they have to deal with a number of miscarriages of justice in South Wales. This is the only case in the country where the real murderer has been caught. Now, they talk about human rights and protecting civil liberties. How were we protected when the real murderer was at liberty? And that is the inevitable consequence of a miscarriage of justice, as blatant as this was. And as in Paddy's case, and in many of the other cases where a crime has actually been committed, the human rights of the public are being put gravely at risk because we are not being protected. The one and sure way to protect the guilty is to convict the innocent. And that means none of us are safe. It is sheer luck that the real murderer of Lynette White did not go on and commit further murders. He could easily have done so, and he would have been protected by a system that wasn't ready to admit the magnitude of the error that was made. When they actually found the real murderer in this case, it obviously meant it wasn't a case of the Cardiff Three were innocent beyond reasonable doubt. They are now innocent beyond any doubt whatsoever. Nobody can say that they were in any way involved in the murder of Lynette White. And that meant the whole system has to explain, how was this allowed to happen? How did you go from 1 white man to 5 black men? How was it possible to secure convictions when the mass of forensic evidence was in that flat proved that they could not have committed this crime? It didn't need the finding of the real murderer to prove this. And people should be asking, why is it necessary to actually find the real murderer to acknowledge what had gone wrong in this particular case? The question is this case an isolated example, or is it one of these cases where it actually proves the methods used to solve this particular case can be used not only to find the people who are guilty of horrible crimes, but also to free the innocent? The methods used actually were novel and revolutionary and really ought to be involved in investigation of all sorts of crimes and protecting the human rights of the public. We have a right to be protected from murderers like Jeffrey Gafford, and we have a right to be protected from brutal murderers who go around committing these crimes and allowing innocent people to go to prison. Now, one of the most absurd things about this case is that there is a real possibility that the real murderer, Jeffrey Gafford,